Les Darcy was born the second eldest of 10 children in 1895 near Maitland. His father Ned was a battling farmer with a weakness for the bottle. Life was no bed of roses, and at age 12, Les left school to become a horse groom, a labourer, and ultimately the family breadwinner. One of Les's younger brothers, Jack, recalls how Les took up boxing.
I was working in a place called Thornton, driving a horse and dray on the line, building the railway line at Thornton. And a chap named Danaher there, he encouraged him quite a lot to take on boxing. He must have thought it was all right. So they arranged a fight between him and a chap named Governor Balsa. And Les was 16, he may have been 20. Anyway, they built a ring out of ropes and stakes out of the bush. And anyway, Les beat him anyway. And that's, as far as I know, that was his first fight.
As a youngster, Les hooked up with a boisterous Irish wharfie, Mick Hawkins, who became his mentor. It would prove to be an everlasting association. Les became an apprentice blacksmith on this site in a foundry in East Maitland, a job that enhanced his natural strength and physique. His boss, a Salvation Army captain, disapproved of boxing, which made it difficult for Les to pursue his goal. But, if anything, it only strengthened his resolve. In what was a hectic schedule, Les would work in the morning, travel from Maitland to Sydney in the afternoon to fight 20-round bouts, and then head home overnight for work the next day. Darcy's iron chin and short jolting punches impressed Sydney Stadium bosses Hugh D. McIntosh and Snowy Baker, and it was after his bout with top-line American Fritz Holland when they realised the enormous potential of the young man from the Hunter Valley. Hawkins and Darcy then got together with renowned Sydney fighter and trainer Dave Smith, who would ultimately mould the rookie into boxing stardom. The trio set up camp at the Spit in the Sydney suburb of Mossman. Les often stayed close to the Sydney Stadium at the Lord Dudley Hotel in Wallara, owned by the O'Sullivan family. It was here Les was to meet his sweetheart, Winnie O'Sullivan. With a string of successes, his prowess in the boxing ring soon rocketed young Darcy to fame. But just 2 weeks after his first fight at the stadium, Britain declared war on Germany, escalating the conflict already raging in Europe. Young Australians enlisted in their thousands to rally behind Mother England. But critics and politicians were asking why a big husky teenager like Darcy was punching Americans at the Sydney Stadium and not fighting the enemy overseas. Les Darcy was in the midst of a major dilemma, as Winnie's brother Maury explains.
Les did want to go to the war. He enlisted in Brisbane. And in those days, to join the armed forces, if you're under 21, your mother or father had to give consent. That's right. Now, Mrs. Darcy refused to give her consent in Brisbane, and Les was allowed to come back to Sydney. He offered down here while he was staying at our place to enlist, but again, Mrs. Darcy would not give her consent.
In April 1915, the Anzacs launched what was to be a fruitless and tragic assault on the shores of Gallipoli. In the ensuing months, 8,500 Australians would die and 19,000 wounded in one of the most disastrous military campaigns ever conducted. Unable to join his mates in the battlefield, Les continued his fighting career and claimed a version of the world middleweight title by beating American Jeff Smith in May of that year. 2 months later, in July, it was the turn of the Oshkosh Terror, Eddie McGorty, to cop it, and how. Here, McGorty would eventually be flattened in 15 rounds, and Darcy would give him yet another hiding 6 months later. Most of the winner's purse from these bouts would help buy a farm for the family. Following his encounter with McGorty, Les picked up his intended fiancée Winnie and her chaperone in his new Buick, and celebrated victory with lemonade and fruitcake. In October, American champ Jimmy Clabby was expected to give Les a tough encounter. Darcy went into battle with a heavy dose of the flu, and it took him the full 20 rounds to outclass his opponent, eventually winning decisively on points. Clabby would later say, "Fighting Darcy was like fighting a gorilla. You could survive 20 rounds if you stayed away, but heaven help you if you hit him." It was the same story in this bout in January 1916 with rugged American lightweight George K.O. Brown in the white trunks. Despite the war, an amazing crowd of over 14,000 turned up to watch their idol do battle with this much-vaunted opponent. It too went the distance, but again, the 20-year-old champ was too classy. Darcy was almost impossible to hurt, but he did have a soft heart. That year, in an ironic twist, his trainer Dave Smith, a former Australian light heavyweight champion, decided on a comeback. Incredibly, Smith would oppose his pupil, Les Darcy, in 2 bouts. Not surprisingly, he lost both, being knocked out on each occasion. Darcy refrained from hurting him badly. In fact, he was once heard pleading with Smith to give in. A few days later, Darcy again defeated Jimmy Clabby, and here, on September 30, 1916, at the Sydney Stadium, Les Darcy was to have his last fight. It was against the big-punching American George Chipp, whose army of supporters back home included the former Wild West gunman Bat Masterson, who tamed his ways into that of a New York sports writer. Chipp had a famous right-hand punch, but that didn't worry Les. In the 9th, the Aussie champ slipped a left and iced the American with a perfect counter. Darcy had chipped Chipp into dreamland in this, his 50th fight. By now, American promoter Tex Rickard was offering huge incentives in a bid to lure Darcy to the US to fight. There was talk of Darcy fighting Jess Willard, the 6'6" Kansas farmer who held the world heavyweight title. On the home front, Prime Minister Billy Hughes waged a strong campaign for conscription to swell the 300,000-strong contingent already serving in the war against Germany. His referendum for compulsory enlistment was lost. Australian men of military age were forbidden to leave the country, and even though other Australian fighters travelled overseas freely, the government said Darcy wasn't going anywhere unless it was in uniform. A decision that delighted promoters Baker and McIntosh, terrified of losing their #1 meal ticket. But his loyalty to his family was paramount, and Les knew a couple of big purses overseas would secure their future. This accomplished, Les would be free to enlist and serve his country. 2 days before his 21st birthday, Les stowed away on a boat to America. He arrived in New York 6 weeks later. Back home, Snowy Baker led the chorus of public vilification, branding Darcy a coward. In the US, Rickard's promises of a fight with Al McCoy, the man Americans regarded as the true middleweight champion, fell through, and the closest Les got to Willard was posing for this photo in Chicago. On April 6, 1917, US President Woodrow Wilson announced that America would join their allies in the war in Europe. Several states barred Les from fighting, and US newspapers told him to enlist, that they didn't like deserters. It was on that day in Chicago when Darcy took the oath of allegiance to become an American citizen, and subsequently joined the American Air Force in Memphis, Tennessee. It was there that authorities finally granted him a fight on May 7, 1917. While training for the fight, Darcy collapsed and was taken to hospital. At first, it was thought he had a simple case of la grippe, or better known as the flu. Doctors diagnosed blood poisoning, apparently triggered by a gum infection occurred a year previously when he lost 2 teeth in a fight against Harold Hardwick in Sydney. Doctors could do little as Darcy's condition deteriorated rapidly. On May 24, 1917, boxing's wonder boy from Maitland passed away in the arms of his sweetheart Winnie O'Sullivan, with Mick Hawkins bedside, holding his hand. When the news reached Sydney, a dark cloud settled over Sydney. It seemed America and Australia both felt a collective guilt for the way Darcy had been persecuted. His body was embalmed and shipped home, accompanied by Hawkins and Winnie O'Sullivan aboard the SS Simona. For 2 days, the body of the champion was placed on view at the Woodcoffle funeral parlours in Sydney, where tens of thousands of mourners filed past. The body was then taken to St Joseph's Church in Woollahra for a requiem mass, attended by a massive congregation. The funeral cortege, led by 200 boxers, proceeded from the church down Oxford Street, past Hyde Park before making its way to the funeral train at Central Railway, bound for Maitland. As this rare footage shows, 250,000 people either formed part of the procession or lined the streets to pay their final respects to their much-loved hero. In addition to a packed Brisbane Express, special trains were laid on to take well over 100,000 people from Sydney, Newcastle and Cessnock to the champion's final resting place, the East Maitland Cemetery. Mourners filed through the home that Les had bought his parents. Rita Tollis, whose son Mick would become a top fighter in the 40s, remembers seeing Darcy in his coffin.
As you come in the house, you had to go up, it was the side of the house. You went up about 4 or 5 steps, and then he was there as you went in. The back of the piano was there with the candles on it, and then he laid there on the stool. And then you had to keep walking down. You went down about 10 steps at the back, and then out. But you had to keep moving.
Family and close friends posed for the cameras in Les's Buick. That's Mick Hawkins and Les's brother Cecil in the front, Mrs. Darcy in the veil, and old Ned at the back of the car. A second Requiem Mass was celebrated on Sunday morning, July 1 by Father O'Gorman, followed by a burial service that afternoon when it was estimated that well over 100,000 mourners bid their final farewell. Hundreds of wreaths were sent from all over Australia and America, but one of those wreaths from Snowy Baker was regarded by Mrs. Darcy as poison ivy, and she promptly sent it back. Les died without a will, and it's believed over £8,000 was seized by his father, who blew the lot. Les's mum never got over her son's death. For years she clung to a lock of his hair. And to add to her despair, Frank Darcy, Les's younger brother by 4 years and an accomplished fighter, died 2 years later in 1919, aged 19, ironically just prior to his scheduled fight with Tom Uren. He was a victim of the great Spanish flu epidemic. And so ended one of the most tragic episodes in Australian sporting history. A young boxer so full of promising, reaching for the stars but kept earthbound by those who could never see that far. There was no opponent in the ring Les couldn't beat. His real opposition was outside the stadium, where he could not win. Adored by his fans, cherished by his family, Les Darcy was a champion at a time when the world's back was turned. He left the ring unfulfilled and, to this day, unforgotten. It's not hard to see why old-timers tell you Les Darcy was simply the greatest.